Is this the best gaming monitor for competitive gamers? We're looking at the Alienware AW2523HF, a 24.5-inch Full HD 360Hz IPS gaming monitor, which at the time of filming and in the UK can be found for a whopping £390, while in the US $450. So is it worth its price tag, and how does it compare to 240Hz monitors? Let's find out. So jumping straight in, let's talk about the monitor's input lag, and here I had it objectively tested at 2.5 milliseconds. You can see here how it compares to the plethora of different monitors that I've recently reviewed, including some 1080p panels, which might be a little bit more relevant given that we are talking about the Full HD resolution. Now subjectively, what I will say is that while playing a competitive game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive, the monitor's input lag didn't hinder my performance. Indeed, my mouse clicks were responding very quickly and therefore left me really content while playing a competitive game. Now similarly, the monitor's response time was seriously impressive, and it really left me jaw-dropped as to how it was dealing with different scenes. Furthermore, I had very much little amount of inverse ghosting even on its extreme mode overdrive, and thus meaning that I could really benefit from the fastest response time. Now to give you some objective data, I used the OSRTT tool, and you can see here that the average initial time towards the bottom left hand side of your screen, and thus translating to the average G2G time, sat at 3.79 milliseconds. Now that's seriously impressive given that we are using the lowest overdrive mode, and that is fast. Now as we move over to the super fast preset, you can see that the average initial time drops down to 3.31 milliseconds. But wait, it gets even better in terms of the extreme mode preset, sitting at a whoppingly low 3.14 milliseconds. Now granted, you will get a little bit of extra RGB overshoot, which you can see denoted towards the middle of your screen thanks to the other colours other than green, and yes, it won't look as clean as the super fast preset, but just putting that into perspective, I've got the UFO ghosting test, and you can see here at 360Hz that the extreme mode preset really doesn't look all that different from the super fast or indeed the fast presets. So with that out of the way, let's talk about its refresh rate, and indeed if you do want to hit 360Hz, you'll have to be plugged in over DisplayPort, because over the two HDMI 2.0 ports, you'll be capped at 255Hz. And yes, that is slightly an odd refresh rate to choose, but nonetheless, it's just something you should be mindful of. So is 360Hz worth it over 240Hz? Well, quite frankly, as someone who shoved over 2,500 hours on competitive Counter-Strike and has reviewed over 200 different monitors, I don't really see a tangible benefit. Now yes, there is a difference between 60Hz and 144Hz, and then there is a fluidity difference between 144Hz and 240Hz, but between 240 and 360Hz or above, I really cannot tell the difference. I would be hard pressed if anyone could truly tell the difference by doing a blind A/B test, in other words not knowing what the refresh rate of the monitor is currently running and having to guess if it is actually running at the maximum 360Hz. Now granted, you're going to get some extra headroom at 360Hz over 240Hz, but I don't quite understand the premium, and I'll talk about this further down in this review, in other words when I get onto my verdict. Now with that in mind, some people might argue to say that you have got better VRR headroom, and well, they would not be mistaken. Given the fact that you have got 360Hz at your disposal, you can effectively get a better tear-free gaming experience. Although it's worth noting that this does not have a native G-Sync module, thus not actually benefiting from the full VRR range. Now in this respect, I was actually able to test this AMD FreeSync certified monitor with my NVIDIA RTX 3080, and in this respect, when connected over DisplayPort, I didn't incur any sort of black screen or flickering issues. Now, is it something that I'll actually use, in other words VR technology such as NVIDIA G-Sync? Well, no. If I'm a hardcore competitive gamer, I'm going to disable it because I do not want to incur any slightest bit of extra input lag, and furthermore I do not want to cap my frames at 360Hz because I could easily output over 400 to 500 FPS, for example on a game such as CSGO or even Valorant. Now to further re-emphasize the point that this monitor is not aimed at the casual crowd, this does not have any sort of HDR signal input, and therefore will be of disappointment to certain individuals. Now, what I should also mention is that this monitor does not have any sort of motion blur reduction technology. Now, this to me is actually quite baffling, and I'm not sure as to why Alienware have chosen this, given the fact that competitive gamers out there will potentially be the target crowd for motion blur reduction. This monitor completely omits it. And yes, I tried it at its highest refresh rate and lower refresh rate all the way down to 240Hz, and motion blur reduction was not available. So therefore, it's another consideration that you should have when potentially looking at this Alienware monitor in comparison to some of the competitors. Now, with the gaming section out of the way, how does this monitor actually look like? Well, it's got a flat 24.5-inch IPS panel that has some matte coating on it. Now, when put across my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 98.2% in comparison to the sRGB standard, and a gamut volume of 113%. You can see below here how it compares to the sRGB standard, whereby it's a little bit off, and therefore translates to an average delta of 1.64 and a maximum of 6.72, whereby lower is better and closer to 0 would be ideal, thus meaning these figures are a little bit disappointing for image editors or video graders. On the flip side, the tested contrast ratio for an IPS panel is pretty impressive at 1159:1, and similarly for the measured white point, it sits at 6697 Kelvin at 100%. As for the gamma curve, it's actually pretty close to the 2.2 standard. Now, while the monitor isn't exactly pinpoint accurate, for gamers out there, you will be pleased to know that the image does pop in terms of the color, and given the fact that you have got good viewing angles thanks to its IPS technologies, it means that you're not going to have any sort of problem while you're gaming. So moving swiftly on, we get on to brightness, and here I had its maximum brightness tested at 372 nits, which is a slight bit off the manufacturer's 400 nits claim, but this means that the monitor has got a good sort of peak brightness and does also have a pretty low brightness as well, showing good range. Now, this does actually lead me on to brightness uniformity, and while it is somewhat panel lottery, I was actually pretty disappointed with my tested panel. I expected better from a 24.5-inch form factor, but alas, over here you can see in terms of the top half, it doesn't do too well. As for backlight bleed, again this is somewhat subjective, but in this respect the tested panel wasn't too bad across the board. Yes, there was a little bit of bleed that could be noticed in certain areas, but frankly for me as a hardcore gamer, I didn't really mind all that much. Of course, if you're playing a lot of darker games or watching, let's say, darker scenes in certain movies, then you might want to consider a VA or a TN panel altogether. Now, moving past the test, I should have a quick word about the monitor's build quality, and here it's got a 3-side borderless design with a pretty thin bezel at the bottom. Furthermore, given the form factor, it shouldn't take too much space on your desk. Now, as for the stand, it's very sturdy and provides height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, therefore meaning that you're going to find the right sort of ergonomics. The stand itself is pretty sturdy and doesn't create any sort of wobble either. Of course, if you do not want the built-in stand, you can replace it with a VESA compatible stand, thus putting it, for example, on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now, aside from this, the monitor has got a headphone stand that pops out on the left-hand side. Elsewhere, you've got 4 USB Type-A ports that can be useful if you are plugging in your peripherals directly into the monitor. Speaking of which, it's got a singular 3.5mm jack headphone output, and this can be pretty handy if you're outputting audio over HDMI or DisplayPort. But it's worth noting that this monitor does not have any sort of built-in speakers, which could be disappointment to certain individuals, although I would expect if you're a hardcore gamer getting this monitor and splashing out this match on it, that you would have a headphone and a DAC, or for example a headset. Now, if you are plugging in your headphones directly into the monitor, you'll probably want to adjust the volume of it, and you can do so by accessing the monitor's OSD. That is done via the little joystick button found underneath it. Now here, via the menu, you will find a plethora of different options and allow you to customize it, for example, adjusting the different overdrive modes that I've referenced before in this review. Aside from this, you might have noticed that RGB lights are completely omitted from the OSD, and that is because the monitor does not have any of those fancy RGB lights, which to me is not something that I actually miss. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and quite frankly I can't see myself actively recommending it. While it does well in terms of the key departments, in other words refresh rate, input lag and response time, it does fall short in terms of its omission of HDR and also motion blur reduction. It doesn't have the full VR range given the fact it doesn't have a native G-Sync module, and also doesn't have pinpoint color accuracy, at least in comparison to the sRGB standards. Furthermore, it's actually very expensive. In this respect, if I had this sort of money, I would actually get a 240Hz 1440p monitor, at least of course if my GPU was able to output 240Hz consistently at said resolution. If it couldn't, then I would save myself a considerable amount of money instead and put it elsewhere, for example on some peripherals or PC components, and get a 1080p 240Hz monitor instead. Of course, this is all considering that if you're a hardcore competitive gamer, because if you're not, you might want to look at 144Hz monitors altogether. Now my suggestions and the ones I would actively recommend will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know in the comment section below as to if 360Hz is something that you would consider over 240Hz, and if it is, why would it be? Now if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.